The sound of rain beating on the roof of the Morrison house echoed like distant drums that September morning. David Morrison woke with a shiver down his spine, not from the cold, but from something he couldn't explain. At 42, he had spent the last 15 years studying the geology of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, and his instincts had never failed him. It was Tuesday, September 15th, and the small town of Cedar Falls awoke under the weight of dark clouds that seemed to have descended from the mountains to embrace the city. David got out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, his wife, who was sleeping deeply after a night caring for little Jake, who had a fever. Even before checking the news on his phone, David already knew something was wrong. Folks, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think is going to happen to the Morrison family. Have you ever been through something similar? Tell us in the comments. Now let's continue. The Morrison house was on Maple Street, a quiet road where wooden houses painted in soft colors contrasted with the deep green of the mountain vegetation. Cedar Falls was one of those postcard towns, population only 3,200. A main street with cozy, a century-old library, and neighbors who had known each other by name for generations. David went down the creaky stairs of the house built in 1952, which he and Sarah had bought when they moved from the University of North Carolina, where they both taught. He in applied geology, she as an English literature professor. The move to Cedar Falls had been a dream come true to raise their children away from the bustle of Charlotte, breathe fresh air, and live in harmony with the nature David so loved to study. But that morning, as he made coffee and looked out the kitchen window, David noticed something that chilled his blood. The small spring running behind his property, a crystal-clear stream that always maintained the same water level, was murky. And not just murky, it was carrying an abnormal amount of sediment. Dad, the voice of Emma, his 16-year-old daughter, brought him back to reality. She came down the stairs, still in pajamas, her brown hair messy from sleep. "Why are you up so early? And why is it raining so much?" David forced a smile. Emma had always been observant, a trait she inherited from him. At 16, she already showed interest in science, especially marine biology, a dream David always encouraged, even knowing they'd have to move to the coast. When it was time for college, just a September rain. Honey, tropical storm coming from the Atlantic. It's normal for this time of year, but it wasn't normal. David knew that. Weather forecasts indicated that Tropical Storm Helena would bring heavy rain, but nothing unusual for the region. What worried him wasn't the rain itself, but what it could cause in soil already saturated from last month's storms. "Is Mom still sleeping?" Emma asked, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. "Yes, she was up all night with Jake." His fever finally broke around 4 a.m. At 12, Jake was Emma's opposite, where she was thoughtful and observant. He was pure energy and adventure. He loved exploring mountain trails, building forts in the woods, and dreamed of becoming a park ranger when he grew up. For the past 2 days, a strong flu had kept him in bed, worrying Sarah more than it should. David turned his attention back to the window. The rain had intensified, and now he could hear branches breaking outside. Something that should have been comforting, the sound of rain had always soothed him, now seemed ominous. "Dad, can I skip school today?" Emma moved closer to the window. "It's raining a lot, and I could help take care of Jake. ... Double quotes. "Absolutely not, young lady." Sarah's voice echoed from the stairs. She came down wearing a navy blue robe, her blonde hair tied in a messy bun. Even after 17 years of marriage, David still felt lucky to have her by his side. "A little rain won't stop you from going to school. Sarah, maybe. ... Double quotes, David began, then stopped. How could he explain a concern based only on instinct? Maybe what? Sarah came closer, studying his expression. After so many years together, she knew all his moods. "David, what's going on?" Before he could answer, the phone rang. David picked up on the third ring. "Hello, David, it's Marcus." The voice of Dr. Marcus Weber, his university colleague and hydrology expert, sounded tense on the other end. "Are you seeing the rainfall data?" David put the phone on speaker and rushed to his laptop on the kitchen table. "No, I just woke up." "What's happening?" Helena shifted course overnight. Instead of heading back to the ocean, she's coming straight for the mountains. And David, the amount of rain forecast for the next 48 hours is 3 times greater than the soil's absorption capacity in the region. Sarah and Emma drew near, watching as David typed quickly, accessing meteorological and geological databases he knew by heart. "My God, ... David murmured, seeing the numbers on the screen. "Marcus, that means ... double quotes. That means we have a real potential for landslides. Multiple ones. And David, you're right in the middle of the highest risk zone." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain. Now pounding the roof with renewed force, Sarah grabbed Emma's hand, instinctively protecting her from something she didn't yet fully understand. David looked out the window again. The stream behind the house was visibly higher now, and the muddy color of the water indicated the hillside soil was already being carried away. His worst suspicions were being confirmed. "Marcus, I need to check some monitoring points. Can you send me the seismic data from the region? It's already in your email." "David, Listen, I think you all should consider leaving town for a few days. Just as a precaution. David hung up and turned to his family. Sarah was watching him with an expression he knew well. It was the same one she'd worn when he first suggested moving to Cedar Falls. A mix of trust in his judgment and worry for the unknown. David, talk to me. Sarah came closer, resting her hand on his shoulder. What's really happening? How could he explain years of geological study in simple words? How to say that the Blue Ridge Mountains, despite their beauty and apparent solidity, were formed of sedimentary rock and clay soil that, when saturated, could shift like liquid. The rains are going to be much heavier than initially predicted, and the soil here, well, when it gets to waterlogged, Dad, you're scaring us. Emma sat at the table, her eyes fixed on him. David took a deep breath. He didn't want to scare his family, but he also couldn't ignore the scientific data before him. Emma, do you remember when we visited California last year and saw those old landslides on Highway 1? Emma nodded. Well, when too much water builds up in mountain soil, it can become unstable like sponge that's soaked up too much water and can't hold anymore. You're saying our mountain could slide? Emma's voice came out thinner than usual. Not our mountain specifically, but David looked out the window once more. I need to check some points. Sarah, maybe it's better you don't take Emma to school today. David Morrison. Sarah crossed her arms, using the tone she always did when she wanted direct answers. Stop circling around and tell me exactly what you're thinking. David loved her for that. Sarah never backed away from hard situations, even when they scared her. It was one of the things that had most attracted him when they met at university. Woman who faced reality head on, without illusions. I'm thinking maybe we should spend a few days at your parents' place in Asheville, just until the storm passes. Asheville is 3 hours away. David, and Jake is sick. Do you really think it's necessary? Before David could respond, a loud sound echoed outside, the sound of something heavy crashing down. They all ran to the living room window and saw that a large tree had fallen on the neighbor's property, but Henderson's completely blocking Maple Street. Well, Sarah murmured, I guess Emma's not going to school anyway. David grabbed his phone and dialed Cedar Falls Emergency Services. After 5 rings, a tired voice answered. Cedar Falls Emergency. Barbara speaking. Barbara, it's David Morrison. I need to speak with Chuck about the landslide evacuation protocols. Dr. Morrison. Evacuation, sir. It's just a storm. We've had plenty like this over the years. Barbara, I need you to transfer me to Chuck immediately. While waiting, David watched his family. Emma had sat on the couch, hugging a pillow, her eyes fixed on the fallen tree outside. Sarah was in the kitchen, probably making tea, her automatic ritual when nervous. David, it's Chuck. Barbara said something about evacuation. Chuck Williams had been Cedar Falls emergency coordinator for 12 years. A practical man, a former firefighter. He knew the town like the back of his hand. But Chuck wasn't a geologist. Chuck, I'm looking at the rainfall and geological data. This storm is going to bring way more water than the soil can absorb. We need to at least consider preventive evacuations in the most vulnerable areas. David, with all due respect, you're being a little dramatic. It's a tropical storm, not a hurricane. We've been through this before. Chuck, we've never faced a situation with this much rain, combined with already saturated soil from last month. The numbers don't lie. The numbers might not lie, David, but they're not everything. I've got practical experience. I'll stick with the normal storm protocols. If something changes, we'll reassess. David hung up, frustrated. It was always the same science versus practical experience. Usually, the two worked hand in hand. But in situations like this, practical experience often underestimated risks that scientific data clearly indicated. What did he say? Sarah came closer, carrying 2 cups of tea. But I'm dramatic. Emma let out a nervous laugh. Well, Dad, you kind of are sometimes. David couldn't help but smile. Emma was right. He tended to be overly cautious when it came to the family's safety. But this time was different. This time, all the data pointed in the same direction. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Jake's arrival. At 12, he still seemed too small for his age. Especially now, with his face pale from the flu, and dark hair stuck to his forehead with fever sweat. Why's everybody up so early? Jake flopped onto the couch next to Emma. And why is it so noisy outside? Storm, little brother. Emma wrapped an arm around him. Dad's worried about landslides. Landslides are cool. Jake brightened for the first time in days. Like the ones we see on the Discovery Channel. They're not cool when they happen in our town. Jake. David sat in the armchair across from the couch. And that's why maybe it's better to visit your grandparents for a few days. Grandparents in Asheville. Jake made a face. But I was going to play video games with Tommy today. His mom said I could come over when I got better. David looked at Sarah. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that the place he'd always felt safe might not be so safe anymore? Jake. Sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry, Sarah said gently. And you're still recovering from the flu. Outside, the wind had picked up, and David could hear more branches snapping. He got up and went to the front window. Maple Street, usually a peaceful road where children played and adults walked their dogs, now looked like a scene from an apocalyptic movie. Beyond the Henderson's tree, He could see leaves and branches scattered everywhere, and rainwater starting to form small streams along the curbs. But what worried him most was something only his trained eyes could see. The water's flow pattern wasn't normal. Instead of following the natural slope of the terrain, it seemed to be shifting direction, indicating the soil was already beginning to give way in some spots. "I need to go out for an hour," David announced, turning back to the family. "Go out, in this storm?" Sarah looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "I need to check some monitoring points on the slopes. If my theory is right, I'll find signs of soil movement." "David, that's dangerous." "Sarah, staying here without knowing what's really happening is more dangerous." Emma got up from the couch. "Can I come with you, Dad?" "Absolutely not. But I could help. I know how to spot the geological signs you taught me." David smiled. Emma really did pay attention during their family hikes. She knew how to identify different rock types, understood how erosion worked, and could even predict where they'd find springs based on topography. "Not this time, honey. But I need you to help me in another way." "How?" "Keep an eye on the spring out back. If the watercolor changes a lot, or if the level rises quickly, call me immediately." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding the importance of the task. David kissed Sarah on the cheek. "I'll be back in an hour, 2 at most." "David, promise me you'll be careful." "I always am. Promise." "I promise." David grabbed his rain jacket, hiking boots, and field backpack equipped with GPS, pH meter, thermometer, and all the tools needed for geological field analysis. Before leaving, he checked his phone one more time. There were 3 missed messages from Marcus and 2 from other university colleagues. All said the same thing. The situation was worsening faster than predicted. David opened the front door and was hit by the full force of the storm. The rain wasn't falling anymore, it was being hurled sideways by the wind. Within seconds, he was soaked, even with the rain jacket. He ran to his Ford pickup, a 2018 F-150 he'd bought specifically to handle the mountain roads in the region. The engine started on the first turn of the Kia Small Victory amid the chaos. As he drove through the empty streets of Cedar Falls, David could see he wasn't the only one worried. Some houses had lights on in every room, and he spotted at least 3 neighbors on their porches, watching the storm with anxious expressions. His first destination was the monitoring point on Old Mountain Road, about 5 miles from town. It was where he had installed measuring equipment 3 years ago as part of a study on slope stability. The road leading there was usually peaceful, a winding route cutting through the dense forest of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But that morning, David had to dodge at least 6 fallen trees, and in 2 spots rainwater had created small torrents crossing the road. When he finally arrived at the site, what David saw made his heart race. The monitoring equipment, an automated weather station connected to seismic sensors, showed readings he had never seen before. Not only was the rainfall amount 3 times the historical average, but the seismic sensors indicated constant micro. David knew what that meant. The soil was moving. He got out of the truck and walked to the edge of the slope, where he could get a panoramic view of the valley where Cedar Falls was located. What he saw left him breathless. The entire opposite slope showed signs of instability. Trees leaning at impossible angles, small scars in the soil where vegetation had been ripped away by earth movement, and little streams that had changed course overnight. David grabbed his phone and called Marcus. "Marcus, I'm at the Old Mountain Road monitoring site, and Marcus, we don't have hours. We have minutes. What are you seeing?" David quickly described his observations, sending photos as he spoke. "David, you need to get out of there now, and you need to get your family out of town." "Marcus, what about the other 3,200 people in Cedar Falls?" "David, you can't save everyone, but you can save your family." As David ran back to the truck, a terrible realization sank in. He was facing the classic dilemma of any disaster expert: warn without causing panic, protect without seeming alarmist, act on scientific data while the rest of the world still saw only a common storm. But this time was different. This time his own family was at risk. The drive back home felt like it lasted forever. At every turn, David expected to find the road blocked by another fallen tree, or, worse, by a landslide already underway. When he finally pulled onto Maple Street, David saw that the situation had worsened significantly. Water was now running through the streets like small rivers, and he could hear the constant sound of sirens in the distance. Sarah opened the door before he even reached the porch. "David, thank God you're back." Emma said the water out back changed color and rose at least a foot since you left. David didn't answer right away. He looked at their house, the home where they had raised their children, where they had shared 17 years of marriage, where they had felt safe and happy. It was more than a house. It was their refuge from the world. But now, that refuge could become a trap. "Sarah, we need to leave now." "Now, but David, ... Now, Sarah. Grab only the essentials. We have maybe an hour before it's too late." Emma appeared in the doorway, holding Jake's hand. They both looked scared, but they trusted their father completely. "Dad, what did you see up there?" David looked into his daughter's eyes that had always shone with scientific curiosity, but now showed real fear for the first time. "I saw that sometimes science is right, even when we'd rather it be wrong." The next hour passed in a blur of frantic activity. Sarah rushed through the house, throwing clothes into bags. while Emma helped Jake gather his most precious toys. David, meanwhile, faced a moral dilemma that consumed him inside: to leave town quietly with his family or try to warn the neighbors about the imminent danger. "Dad, why can't we take Buster?" Jake held his hamster in a small cage, his eyes full of tears. David knelt beside his son. Buster was more than a pet. He was Jake's confidant, his companion on lonely afternoons when Emma was with her school friends. "Of course we'll take Buster, champ. You just need to put the cage carefully in the car." While Jake ran to the car with his hamster, David saw through the window that the Hendersons, their next-door neighbors, still hadn't realized the seriousness of the situation. Bob Henderson was in the garage, trying to saw through the tree that had fallen on his property, while his wife, Margaret, swept leaves from the porch as if it were just another rainy day. "Sarah," David shouted up the stairs. "How much longer do you need?" 5 minutes, came the reply from the bedroom. David looked at the clock. Las 10:47 alto m. By his calculations, based on seismic data and soil saturation, they had until noon before the landslides truly began. But those were only estimates. Nature did not follow scientific schedules. He made a decision. Running over to the Hendersons' house, David knocked urgently on the door. Margaret opened it, drying her hands on a flowered apron. "David, come in, you're soaked." "Margaret, you need to leave town, now." "Leave? Because of the rain?" Margaret laughed. "David, we've been through worse storms than this. This is different." "Margaret, the ground is unstable. There could be landslides." Bob appeared behind his wife, still holding the chainsaw. "David, you're exaggerating. I've lived here 40 years. These mountains are solid as rock." "Bob, I'm a geologist. I know what I'm talking about, and I was born and raised here. I've never seen a landslide in Cedar Falls." David took a deep breath, trying to control his frustration. How could he convince people who based their decisions on personal experience when the scientific data screamed danger? "Bob, Margaret, at least consider going to stay with relatives for a few days, just as a precaution." "David, you're scaring Margaret for nothing." Bob placed a protective hand on his wife's shoulder. "We'll stay here and take care of our property." When David returned home, he found his family gathered in the garage, their bags already loaded into the car. Sarah was holding a backpack with important documents, while Emma had prepared a small bag of provisions. "Did you convince the Hendersons?" Sarah asked, seeing David's expression. "No, they think I'm exaggerating. And are you?" The question came from Emma, who was watching her father with that analytical look she always used when trying to understand something complicated. David paused. It was a fair question. Could years of study and scientific caution be making him see dangers where none existed? "Emma, do you remember what I always say about science? That the data doesn't lie, but people sometimes interpret it wrong?" "Exactly. So let me show you the data." David pulled his laptop from the backpack and showed Emma the seismic readings, rainfall indices, and satellite images Marcus had sent. "See these little red dots on the map?" David pointed at the screen. "Each one represents a microfracture in the ground. Under normal conditions, we'd have maybe 2 or 3 in the whole region. Now we have 47. Emma studied the data with the seriousness of an experienced scientist. "And what does that mean exactly?" "It means the ground is preparing to move, like cracks in a wall before it collapses." "Dad," Jake interrupted from the back of the car, "can we go now? Buster's getting nervous with all this rain." David closed the laptop. It was time to leave. But when he started the car, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of emergency sirens coming from several different directions. It wasn't the typical pattern of an ambulance or fire truck. It was multiple sirens, suggesting a widespread emergency. "David, do you hear that?" Sarah placed her hand on his arm. Before David could respond, his phone rang. It was Chuck Williams, the emergency coordinator. "David, you were right. What happened?" "Landslide on Highway 19, 2 miles north of town. Completely blocked the road. And David, there are at least 3 cars buried." David's stomach sank. Highway 19 was the main route out of Cedar Falls to the north toward Asheville, where they had planned to take refuge. "Chuck, how many exit routes are still open?" "For now, the south road to Brevard is still passable." "But David, if you were right about Highway 19, you might be right about other things too." David hung up the phone and turned to his family. "Change of plans? We're going to Uncle Pete's in Brevard." Pete was Sarah's younger brother, a lawyer who had moved to Brevard 5 years earlier for a quieter life. His house was in a lower geologically stable area. "David, Brevard is the opposite direction of Asheville," Sarah pointed out. "What if the other roads closed?" It was a risk, but staying in Cedar Falls was a greater risk. As they drove down Main Street, David could see the town was beginning to wake up to the reality of the situation. Several stores had closed early, and he saw at least 2 families loading their cars with the same urgency as his own. At the Main and Elm Street intersection, David pulled up next to a car. He recognized it was Tom Bradley, the local high school history teacher and longtime neighbor. Tom rolled down the window despite the rain. "David, are you leaving town?" "Yes, Tom, and you should consider doing the same." "I thought about it, but my wife thinks I'm being paranoid." Tom gestured toward the passenger seat where David could see Linda Bradley shaking her head no. She doesn't want to leave the house. Tom, sometimes it's better to be paranoid and alive than brave and dead. The light turned green, and David had to drive on. But in the rearview mirror, he saw Tom making a U-turn, a small victory in the midst of chaos. As they left downtown behind and entered the rural road toward Brevard, the storm seemed to intensify. The wind rocked the pickup, and David had to grip the wheel tightly to stay in control. "Dad, look at that." Emma pointed to the left. David looked and saw something that made him slam on the brakes. A small hillside beside the road showed clear signs of recent movement, trees fallen in a specific direction, dark soil exposed where there should have been grass, and a small crater where a section of ground had simply vanished. "My God," Sarah murmured. "It's really happening." David pulled over and grabbed his phone. He needed to document what he was seeing and send it to Marcus and Chuck. "David, what are you doing? Shouldn't we stop here?" Sarah looked nervously at the slope. "Just a minute. I need to record this." David got out and walked to the edge of the road. What he saw alarmed him. Even more, the scar from the landslide was fresh, very fresh. The soil was still wet and shiny, indicating it had happened within the last few hours. But the scariest part was that this wasn't a slide caused only by rain. The geological characteristics suggested it had been triggered by vibration, probably heavy vehicles on the road combined with soil instability. If small vibrations were causing slides, then the situation was far worse than he had imagined. David rushed back to the car, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just seen. They weren't just fleeing a possible disaster, they were fleeing in the middle of one already unfolding. "Dad, you look like you saw a ghost," Emma observed. "Worse than a ghost, honey. I saw proof it may already be too late." As they continued toward Brevard, David noticed other families had made the same decision. The traffic on the road, usually non-existent on a Tuesday morning, was surprisingly heavy. Cars loaded with luggage, entire families squeezed into small vehicles, even horses being hauled in trailers. Tropical Storm Helena had officially become an exodus. 15 miles from Cedar Falls, they encountered their first improvised checkpoint. 2 state police cars partially blocked the road, forcing all vehicles into a single lane. The officer approaching David's car looked tired and worried. "Good morning, sir. Where are you headed, Brevard?" "We're leaving Cedar Falls as a precaution." "Good decision, sir. The situation there is deteriorating quickly." The officer leaned in to get a better look at the car's interior. "Kids, are you okay?" "Yes, sir," Emma answered politely. "We're going to our uncle's house." "Excellent, sir. Keep your speed low and watch for debris on the road." "We've had 3 more minor slides since early this morning." As they pulled away from the checkpoint, Sarah turned to David. 3 slides? In how many hours?" "About 4 hours, from what I understood, and how many more could happen?" David didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't know. Landslides weren't like earthquakes, which followed predictable seismic patterns, or hurricanes, which had trackable they were chaotic phenomena, influenced by hundreds of variables: soil type, slope, vegetation, water saturation, vibrations, even microscopic factors like mineral composition. "I don't know, Sarah. I hope only a few," but David suspected it was only the beginning. Pete's house was a quiet 2-story cottage in Brevard, about 40 minutes from Cedar Falls under normal conditions. That day, with heavy rain and traffic, the trip took nearly an hour and a half. Pete was waiting on the porch when they arrived, holding an umbrella big enough to shield the whole family as they ran from the garage to the house. "Sarah, David, I'm so glad you're safe." Pete hugged his sister tightly. At 38, he had the same warm personality as Sarah, but with the practicality of someone who had worked years in the legal system. "I heard on the radio about the slides. Did you see anything on the way?" "We saw signs," David replied, accepting a towel to dry off. "Pete, thank you for taking us in with so little notice. Family is family. David, you can stay as long as you need." Pete's house overlooked the mountains, but was in a geologically stable area-wide valley. Good soil drainage, far from steep slopes. David had chosen Brevard not just for proximity to Pete, but because he knew it was safe. Emma and Jake settled in the living room, turning on the TV to follow the local news. What they saw left them silent. The 3rd landslide recorded today in the Blue Ridge Mountains has completely blocked Highway 74, leaving several communities isolated. The governor has declared a state of emergency for Henderson, Transylvania, and Buncombe counties. Dad, Emma called. "They're talking about Cedar Falls." David and Sarah joined the kids in front of the TV. The reporter, broadcasting from a helicopter, showed aerial images that made David swallow hard. The once familiar Blue Ridge landscape was unrecognizable. Where green slopes covered with trees had once been, there were now brown scars, open wounds in the earth where the ground had collapsed. Highway 19, their original escape route, was completely blocked by a wall of mud and rocks at least 20 feet high. Double quotes, ... Authorities estimate that at least 15 homes have been affected by the landslides, and rescue teams are still searching for possible victims. Residents are advised to evacuate immediately if they haven't done so already. ... Double quotes, David. Sarah whispered, "What if we hadn't left?" David didn't answer, but the images on the screen made the truth obvious. His decision to trust the scientific data over local experience had literally saved their lives. Jake, who had been quiet during the broadcast, finally spoke. "Dad, is our house okay?" It was the question David dreaded. On the screen, he could see the general area where Maple Street was, but individual homes weren't visible from the helicopter's altitude. "I don't know yet, buddy, but what matters is that we're all safe, and the Hendersons and Tommy." Jake's chest tightened. Tommy was his best friend, the Henderson son, the same family that had refused to leave when David tried to warn them. "We don't know yet, Jake. The rescue teams are still checking all the houses." Pete, who had been quiet during the news, finally spoke. "David, you saved your family." Not many fathers would have had the courage to make that decision based solely on scientific data. It wasn't courage, Pete, it was fear. Fear of what might happen if I was right and did nothing. David's phone rang. It was Marcus. "David, where are you, Revered?" "At my brother-in-law's, Marcus." "Are you watching the news?" "I am, and David, there's something you need to know. The slides happening now are only the smaller ones. The seismic data shows much greater instability forming on the north face of the main mountain." David's blood ran cold. "You're talking about the face directly above downtown Cedar Falls." "Exactly, David. If that face goes, it won't be just a few homes. It will be the whole town." David stepped away from his family to continue the conversation privately. "Marcus, what's the probability, based on current data?" 70% in the next 6 hours. 70%, double quotes David repeated, trying to process the information. "Marcus, that would mean ... It would mean Cedar Falls might simply cease to exist." David looked at his family, gathered in Pete's cozy living room, watching TV, and beginning to relax for the first time since morning. Jake was playing with Buster, Emma was texting friends, and Sarah was talking with Pete about plans for the coming days. They were safe. His family was safe. But what about the other 3,200 people in Cedar Falls? "Marcus, have you told the authorities?" "I tried. I spoke with state police, civil defense, even the governor's office. But David, you know how it is. Scientific data versus practical experience. They think we're being alarmist. And maybe we are," David said, though he didn't believe it. "David, you know the data better than anyone. What's your gut telling you?" David closed his eyes. His gut, the same that had woken him with unease that morning. The same that had made him see danger where others saw only rain, was screaming that they had very little time. "Marcus, I need to make one more call." David hung up and immediately dialed Chuck Williams. "Chuck, it's David Morrison." "David, thank God you called. Your prediction about the landslides was right. But man, you saved your family at the last minute." "Chuck, I need to talk about something bigger. Bigger than 3 simultaneous slides. Much bigger." "Chuck, the data indicates the north face of the main mountain is unstable." Silence on the other end. "Chuck, you there?" "David, please tell me you're not suggesting what I think you are." "I'm suggesting a full evacuation of Cedar Falls. Now." "David, that's impossible. I can't order a full town evacuation based on ... on speculative scientific data." "Chuck, the data isn't speculative. These are real measurements of seismic movement and geological instability." "David, even if I wanted to, I don't have the authority. It would take the governor declaring full emergency, mobilizing the National Guard." "You're talking about a military operation. And how many lives is a military operation worth?" "Chuck, David, you're asking me to evacuate 3,200 people based on a possibility. What if you're wrong? And what if I'm right?" The call ended in silence. Chuck having hung up without answering, David returned to the living room, where his family had made sandwiches and was trying to create a normal atmosphere amid the chaos. Pete had started up a generator just in case they lost power, and Sarah was helping Emma with homework she had brought along. "Dad," Jake called to him, "do you think we can go back home tomorrow?" David sat beside his son on the couch. How could he explain to a 12-year-old that home might mean something very different from now on? "I don't know, Jake. We may have to stay here with Uncle Pete for a few more days." "That's okay. It's fun here. And Uncle Pete said he can teach me to fish at the lake." Jake's innocence contrasted painfully with the weight of responsibility on David's shoulders. While his son planned fishing trips, he was calculating the odds of a catastrophe that could kill thousands. Outside, the storm raged on. Through Pete's living room window, David could see the trees in the yard bending dangerously under the wind's force. But the house was solid, built on rock foundation, in stable ground. They were safe. But David couldn't stop thinking about the people who weren't. At 3:30 p.m., David's phone rang again. It was an unfamiliar number. "Hello, Dr. Morrison. This is Commander Sarah Jenkins, North Carolina National Guard. I need to speak with you urgently." David's heart raced. "Of course, Commander. What can I do?" "Dr. Morrison, your colleagues at the university contacted us. We understand you have data on possible geological instability in the Cedar Falls area." "Yes, Commander. Very concerning data. Dr. Morrison, we need you to come immediately to our command center in Hendersonville. We have a situation developing rapidly, and we need your expertise." David looked at his family. Sarah watched him with that expression he knew so well, a mix of pride and worry. She knew he could never sit still when he could help. "Commander, I can be there in 40 minutes. Excellent. Dr. Morrison, bring all the data you have. And Doctor, thank you for insisting on your warnings. You may have saved many lives." David hung up and turned to his family. "You have to go, don't you?" Sarah asked softly. "I do, Sarah. They're finally taking the data seriously. Maybe there's still time to." Sarah stepped closer and kissed him. "Go. Do what you need to do. We'll be here when you come back." "Dad." Emma stood up. "Can I go with you?" Emma, "Dad, you always said science is meant to help people. Let me help." David looked into his daughter's eyes. At 16, Emma already showed a scientific understanding that surpassed many of his university students, and maybe her young perspective could be useful. "Pete, can you take care of Jake?" "Of course, David. Jake and I will get fishing gear ready for when this storm passes." 15 minutes later, David and Emma were on the road to Hendersonville, driving through the storm toward the National Guard Command Center. David didn't know what he would find there, but he knew it could mean the difference between saving an entire city or watching its destruction. In the rearview mirror, he saw Pete and Jake waving from the porch, with Sarah beside them holding Buster in the cage. His family was safe. Now it was time to try to save the rest. Folks, if you're following this story, leave in the comments what you think will happen at the command center. Do you think David will manage to convince the authorities to evacuate Cedar Falls in time? This story is getting to me, and I hope it's getting to you too. The National Guard Command Center in Hendersonville was a temporary structure set up in a local high school gymnasium. When David and Emma arrived, they were greeted by a scene of frantic activity that resembled disaster movies: uniformed people running back and forth, phones constantly ringing, and an entire wall covered with maps, charts, and computer screens. Commander Sarah Jenkins was a woman of about 40, with gray hair tied in a military bun and a presence that commanded immediate respect. She approached David as soon as he entered. "Dr. Morrison, thank you for coming so quickly. And this must be my daughter Emma. She has knowledge in geology and can help with data analysis." The commander studied Emma for a moment, then nodded. "Welcome, Emma. We need all the help we can get." Jenkins led David and Emma to a central table where several officers and specialists were gathered. David recognized Marcus Weber, who had driven from Chapel Hill, and also saw Dr. Robert Chen, a seismologist he knew from academic conferences. "Gentlemen, this is our current situation," Jenkins began, pointing to a large map of the region. "We now have 7 confirmed landslides in a 20-square-mile area, 3 on Highway 19, 2 on Highway 74, 1 on Rural Road 191, and 1 that has completely blocked northern access to Cedar Falls." David studied the map. The red dots marking the landslides formed a pattern that worried him deeply. "Commander, these landslides are not random," David observed. "They're following specific fault lines in the region's geological structure. Is that good or bad?" asked Major Thompson, a tall man with scars that suggested combat experience. "Major, imagine you have a wall with small cracks," Emma replied before David could speak. "When you put pressure on one crack, it doesn't just grow, it spreads to the other cracks as well." David smiled inwardly. Emma had explained in simple terms what it would take him several minutes to describe technically. "Exactly," David continued. "The landslides that have already happened are creating additional pressure in other areas that are already unstable. It's a geological domino effect." Marcus approached the table, carrying a laptop. "David, Emma, you need to see this." On the computer screen, Marcus showed a 3D simulation of the Cedar Falls region based on the most recent seismic data. "This model shows the underground structure of the mountains," Marcus explained. "The red areas indicate critical instability, yellow indicates moderate instability, and green indicates stability." David felt his stomach sink. The map was almost entirely red and yellow. "Marcus, when was this data collected?" 2 hours ago." "David, the situation is deteriorating much more quickly than any model predicted." "Commander," Jenkins studied the map with a grave expression. "Doctors, in practical terms, what does this mean?" "It means Cedar Falls is sitting on a geological time bomb," David replied, "and the clock is speeding up. How much time do we have?" David exchanged looks with Marcus and Dr. Chen. It was the question everyone feared. Based on the current progression of instability, Dr. Chen answered slowly. "We estimate between 2 and 4 hours before a catastrophic event." Catastrophic event. A massive landslide that could affect the entire urban area of Cedar Falls, David explained. "Commander, we're talking about a volume of earth and rock equivalent to a 20-story building moving at 60 miles per hour. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain hitting the gym roof." "How many people are still in Cedar Falls?" Jenkins asked in aid. "Based on the latest reports, we estimate approximately 2,800 people. Some families have already left on their own, but most remain." 2,800 people, Jenkins repeated, as if testing the weight of the number. "Dr. Morrison, what is your recommendation?" David took a deep breath. It was the moment that would define not only his career, but potentially the lives of thousands of people. immediate and complete evacuation of Cedar Falls and adjacent areas? Are you sure about this recommendation, Commander? In science, we never have absolute certainty, but I have enough confidence in the data to stake my professional reputation, and more importantly, I have enough confidence to have evacuated my own family. Jenkins turned to Marcus and Dr. Chen. Do you agree with Dr. Morrison? Both nodded gravely. Very well. Jenkins addressed Major Thompson. Major, initiate emergency evacuation protocols. I want every civilian out of Cedar Falls within the next 2 hours. Commander, that will require, Thompson began. It will require everything we have. Major, mobilize all available resources. Helicopters, trucks, personnel, everything. As Thompson ran off to coordinate the evacuation, Jenkins turned back to David. Dr. Morrison, I need you to monitor the situation continuously. If anything changes in the data, I need to know immediately. Of course, Commander. And Dr. I hope you're wrong. Commander, I've never wanted so much to be wrong in my life. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of intense activity. David and Emma took turns monitoring seismic equipment, analyzing satellite data, and coordinating with field teams spread throughout the region. Marcus kept constant contact with colleagues at universities across the southeast, creating an informal network of experts all focused on the same question. Would Cedar Falls survive the night? Emma proved surprisingly competent, identifying patterns in the data that even David had overlooked. Dad, look at this, Emma called at 6:30 p.m., pointing at a screen full of wavy lines. The seismic readings are showing a different pattern in the last hour. David stepped closer and studied the data. Emma was right, something had changed. Marcus, can you come here? Marcus joined them, analyzing the same readings. His expression gradually shifted from curiosity to alarm. David, this isn't good. What are you seeing? The vibrations are synchronizing. Before, we had random microtremors across the region. Now they're starting to follow the same rhythmic pattern. David immediately understood the implications. Like a building swaying in the wind before it collapses. Exactly. Emma looked between her father and Marcus. Does that mean it will happen sooner? Much sooner, David replied, already running toward Commander Jenkins. Commander, David shouted across the gym, we need to speed up the evacuation. Jenkins approached quickly. What changed? The seismic data shows synchronization in the vibrations. It's a classic indicator of imminent collapse. How much time? An hour? Maybe less. Jenkins grabbed the radio immediately. Major Thompson, status of the evacuation. Commander, we've removed approximately 1,200 people so far. We still have at least 1,600 in town. Major, we no longer have 2 hours. We have 1 hour, at most. Commander, that's impossible. We can't move 1,600 people in an hour. David felt something collapse inside him. They had detected the danger, convinced the authorities, mobilized massive resources, and still, it wouldn't be enough. Commander, David said softly, there's something else we can try. What? Emergency alert system. Radio, television, sirens. Instruct people to seek shelter in the safest place they can find. Shelter from what, Doctor? You yourself said it would be like a 20-story building moving at 60 miles per hour. David closed his eyes. She was right, there was no adequate shelter for an event of that magnitude. Dad, Emma touched his arm. What if you're wrong? David looked at his daughter. What do you mean? What if the landslide isn't as big as you think? What if it's only part of the mountain, not all of it? David considered the possibility. In all his concern with the worst-case scenario, had he considered less catastrophic alternatives? Marcus, can you run the data assuming partial instability instead of total collapse? Marcus typed quickly, modifying parameters in the simulation. After a few minutes, a new image appeared on the screen. Interesting, Marcus murmured. If only the northeastern section of the mountain face slides, the impact would be concentrated in a much smaller area. Which areas would be safe? Downtown? Ironically, the natural topography would channel the slide around the Central Valley. David studied the new model carefully. It was possible, even likely, that his initial analysis had been too conservative. Commander, we can direct the evacuation to specific areas instead of a total evacuation. Which areas? David pointed at the map. Everything north of Main Street needs to evacuate immediately, but people to the south can seek shelter in solid structures. Jenkins considered the option. That would save significant time in the evacuation, and potentially save more lives. David added. Very well, Major Thompson. Change of strategy. At 7:45 p.m., David received a call he had been dreading all day. Dad, it's Pete. Pete, what happened? David, Jake is asking if he can call Tommy. He wants to make sure his friend is okay. David felt his chest tighten. The Henderson family, who had refused to evacuate in the morning, lived exactly in the zone that they had now identified as highest risk. Pete, can you tell Jake that we're still trying to contact all the families? David, they didn't manage to get out, did they? I don't know. Pete, I hope so. When David hung up, Emma was beside him. The families who didn't want to leave when you tried to warn them? Yes, Dad. You did everything you could. Did I? Emma took her father's hand. Dad, you saved our family. You tried to save the neighbors, now you're here trying to save an entire city. If that's not doing everything you can, I don't know what is. David hugged his daughter, grateful for her early wisdom. At 16, Emma already understood that sometimes doing the best you can doesn't guarantee the best outcome. At 8:15 p.m., the emergency loudspeakers echoed throughout Cedar Falls. Attention residents of Cedar Falls. This is an emergency alert. All residents north of Main Street must evacuate immediately. All residents south of Main Street must seek shelter in the sturdiest structure available. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. David watched through the gym window as National Guard helicopters flew over the region, their spotlights cutting through the darkness of the storm. Military trucks sped along the roads, carrying families to safe areas. At 8:32 p.m., the seismographs began to record something David had never seen before, rhythmic progression of vibrations that increased in intensity with each cycle. Marcus, are you seeing this? I'm seeing it. David, this is before Marcus could finish the sentence. A real vibration rippled through the gym, not recorded only by the equipment, but physically felt by everyone in the building. Was that an earthquake? Emma asked. No, David replied, looking at the seismic data. That was the beginning. Commander Jenkins approached quickly. Doctor, what just happened? The movement has started. Commander, the mountain is preparing to slide. Jenkins grabbed her radio. All units, prepare for a major seismic event. I repeat, prepare for a major seismic event. David looked at the clock. 8:34 p.m. by his calculations. They had less than 20 minutes. Folks, I don't know about you, but my heart is racing writing this part. David and Emma managed to convince the authorities. The evacuation is underway, but will there be enough time? And what happened to the Henderson family, and Tommy, Jake's friend? Leave in the comments what you think will happen in the next few minutes. 8:47 p.m. The seismic equipment at the command center was recording vibrations that David had never seen in his 15-year career. The lines on the monitor were no longer smooth waves, they were aggressive spikes, suggesting that millions of tons of earth and rock were preparing to move. Commander Jenkins, David shouted across the gym, evacuate everyone from the North Zone now. We have no more time. Jenkins was on the radio, frantically coordinating with teams spread across Cedar Falls. Unit 7, status of the Maple Street evacuation. Commander, we still have 3 families refusing to leave. They've barricaded themselves in their homes. David felt his stomach sink. He knew who those families were, people like the Hendersons, who had lived in the mountains all their lives and couldn't believe their solid land could turn liquid in a matter of minutes. Unit 7, you are authorized for forced removal, Jenkins ordered. Commander, we don't have time. I need at least 15 minutes to... Another vibration ran through the gym. Stronger this time. Emma instinctively grabbed David's arm. Dad, that was bigger than the previous one. Much bigger. David studied the data. Marcus, the progression is accelerating exponentially. Marcus nodded gravely. David, from the readings we're talking minutes, not 15 or 20. David made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Commander Jenkins, order the immediate withdrawal of all evacuation teams from the North Zone. Doctor, if they stay there trying to force evacuations, we'll lose not only the residents but also our own first responders. We need to save who we can save. Jenkins hesitated for a moment, a hesitation that David understood perfectly. It was the hardest decision any commander could make. Abandon people to save others. All units in the North Zone, immediate withdrawal. I repeat, immediate withdrawal from the North Zone. Commander, we still have civilians here. Soldier, that is a direct order. Get out now. David looked at the clock. 8:51 p.m., according to the seismic equipment. The mountain was literally vibrating like an engine about to explode. Emma, David turned to his daughter. I need you to coordinate communications with the field teams. Marcus and I will monitor the seismic data. Dad, I can do more than that. Let me help with the analysis. Emma, you're already helping more than you realize. Emma headed to the communications table, where younger officers welcomed her immediately. David felt proud to see that his daughter, at 16, was keeping calm in a situation that made experienced adults tremble. 8:54 p.m., the radio crackled with reports from the field teams. Command Center, this is Unit 12. We just passed mile marker 15 on Highway 19. The asphalt is cracking. The cracks are forming as we watch. Unit 12, leave the area immediately. Command Center, Unit 3 reporting. We're in the southern evacuation zone, and we can hear something that sounds like a train approaching. But there are no tracks here. David and Marcus exchanged looks. They knew exactly what that sound was. It's the sound of millions of tons of earth moving, Marcus murmured. 8:56 p.m., David picked up his cell phone and called Pete. Pete, it's me, David. We're seeing helicopters everywhere. What's happening? Pete, take Sarah, Jake, and Buster to the basement. Now. David, you're scaring me. Pete, I don't have time to explain basement now. And Pete, yes, tell Sarah that I love her. And tell Jake that Daddy is trying to bring Tommy home. Before Pete could respond, David hung up. There was no time for proper goodbyes. 8:57 p.m. The seismographs began to record something that defied scientific explanation. The vibrations weren't just increasing in intensity, they were organizing into waves that traveled through the entire structure of the mountain. David Marcus shouted, "Look at this!" On the computer screen, a real-time simulation showed what was happening inside the mountain. It was like watching a demolition in slow-motion. Geological layers that had remained stable for thousands of years were separating, misaligning, preparing to slide. "How much time?" Emma shouted from the communications table. "Seconds," David replied. 8:58 p.m., the last radio report from the North Zone arrived. "Command Center, this is Unit 7. We managed to evacuate 2 more families, but, my God, the mountain, it's moving." And then, at 8:59 p.m., it happened. The sound came first, a roar that David would later describe as the sound of the earth itself screaming. It wasn't just noise. It was a vibration that ran through the bones, that made internal organs tremble, that turned the air into something almost solid. The entire gym shook. It wasn't an earthquake tremor, it was the impact of millions of tons of earth hitting the valley like a giant wave. All the lights went out. In the dark, David heard Emma scream, "Dad, I'm here." David shouted back, groping through the gym until he found his daughter. "Emma, are you okay?" "I am. But the equipment..." David didn't need to see the equipment to know there was no more data to monitor. Whatever had happened had already happened. The emergency generator kicked in after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the lights came back on, David saw a gym full of people and shock-experienced military officers looking at each other with expressions of those who had just witnessed something that defied comprehension. Commander Jenkins was the first to regain her composure. "Damage report," she shouted. "I want to know what happened out there." The radios began crackling with reports from teams that were in the safe zones. "Command Center, Unit 15. We're in the southern zone of Cedar Falls, the North Zone." "Commander, the North Zone no longer exists." "Explain yourself, soldier." "Commander, where there used to be houses and streets, there is now mud. A lot of mud. Yards and yards of mud." David approached the map table, studying the coordinates, the soldiers reported. Slowly, an image began to form of what had happened. "Marcus," David called, "based on the reports, it seems our prediction of a partial slide was correct." "You mean it wasn't the entire mountain?" "No. It looks like it was a significant section of the northeast face." "Exactly as our second simulation predicted." Emma joined them. "Does that mean downtown is intact?" Before David could respond, another report came in over the radio. "Command Center, Unit 9. We're flying over Main Street. The central commercial area is surprisingly intact. Some windows broken by the tremors, but the main structures are standing." David felt a wave of relief. His second analysis had been correct. The landslide had followed the valley's natural path, skirting downtown. "And the northern zone?" Jenkins asked. "Commander, the northern zone. You'd better see for yourselves. We're sending satellite images." A large screen on the wall lit up, showing aerial images of Cedar Falls captured by the National Guard helicopter. David looked and felt the air leave his lungs. The northern part of the city where Maple Street, the Morrison house, the Henderson house had completely disappeared. In place of the familiar streets and cozy homes, there was an alien landscape of brown mud, uprooted trees, and unrecognizable debris. It was as if someone had run a giant eraser over that part of town. "My God," Emma whispered beside her father. "Our house." "Emma, our house was just wood and bricks. Our family is safe. That's what matters." But even as he comforted his daughter, David felt the weight of the loss. Not just his house, but an entire community had been wiped off the map in a matter of minutes. "Commander," an officer approached Jenkins. "We have a preliminary casualty report." David held his breath. "Based on the evacuations carried out and the field team reports, we estimate 14 people didn't manage to leave the impact zone in time." 14 people. David closed his eyes, trying to process the number. 14 lives that could have been saved if he had been more persuasive in the morning, if people had taken the scientific alerts more seriously, if they had had more time, but also 2,786 people who were alive because they had evacuated or sought proper shelter. "Dr. Morrison," Jenkins approached, "I want you to know that your analyses saved thousands of lives today, and cost 14. David replied softly, "Doctor, without your alerts, we would have lost the entire northern zone. That would have been at least 800 people. You didn't cost 14 lives, you saved almost 800. David knew Jenkins was logically right, but emotionally he still felt the weight of every life he hadn't managed to save. "Commander," Emma interrupted, "is there a list of the names of the people who didn't get out?" Jenkins consulted a clipboard. "We're still compiling it, but we have some preliminary confirmations." David knew Emma was thinking the same thing he was. "The Henderson family and little Tommy." "The Henderson family from Maple Street?" David asked. Jenkins checked the list and shook her head. "Actually, Doctor, they got out. Report from Unit 7 confirms that Bob and Margaret Henderson were evacuated at 8:43, along with a 12-year-old boy." David felt immense relief. "Tommy, the boy was Tommy." "Emma," David turned to his daughter, "can you call Uncle Pete and tell Jake that Tommy is okay?" Emma smiled for the first time in hours. I can call Tommy himself. I have his number. While Emma made the call, David approached the gym window. Outside, the storm was still going on, but it seemed less intense. Nature had unleashed its fury and was now beginning to calm. Dr. Morrison Marcus approached. You saved your family. You saved a city. And you helped establish protocols that could save other cities in the future. Marcus, I did what any geologist would have done with the same data. No, David, any geologist would have written a report and sent it to colleagues. You put your reputation at risk, faced skeptics, and insisted until someone listened. There's a difference between knowledge and courage. David looked around the gym. Military officers continued coordinating rescue and recovery operations. Specialists analyzed data to fully understand what had happened. And somewhere out there, 2,786 people were alive because a geologist decided to trust numbers instead of traditional experience. Dad, Emma, came over, putting away the phone. I talked to Jake. He's super excited because Tommy is okay and because he'll get to go fishing with Uncle Pete tomorrow. And how is he dealing with the house? You know what he said? He said the house was just a place where we lived, but family is who we are. And that as long as we're all together, we still have a home. David hugged his daughter, impressed by the wisdom of a 12-year-old child. Emma, do you think we did the right thing? Dad, you've always taught me that science exists to protect people. Today, you protected almost 3,000 people. If that's not doing the right thing, I don't know what is. At 11:30 p.m., David and Emma finally left the command center. The storm had almost completely passed, leaving only a light drizzle and the distant sound of rescue helicopters. On the way back to Brevard, they passed checkpoints where Cedar Falls refugees were being processed and sent to temporary shelters. David saw entire families' parents carrying sleeping children, grandparents leaning on canes, teenagers hugging Petzl with the same expression of those who had lost everything material but kept everything that truly mattered. Dad, Emma broke the silence. What's going to happen to Cedar Falls now? I don't know, dear. Some parts of the city can be rebuilt. Others may have to remain as they are. And us? Where are we going to live? David thought about the question. For 17 years, Cedar Falls had been more than his home, it had been his identity. He was David Morrison, the geologist from Cedar Falls. Now, half the city had literally been erased from the map. Emma, your mother and I have always talked about maybe moving closer to the coast when you went to college. Maybe it's time to consider that seriously, and are you going to keep being a geologist? Emma, after today, I think I understand better than ever why I chose this profession. It's not just studying rocks and soil. It's using science to protect people. When they arrived at Pete's house in Brevard, it was almost midnight. Sarah was waiting on the porch, holding a cup of tea and wearing a blanket over her shoulders. David, Emma, Sarah ran to hug them. We were watching the news. You saved the city. We saved what we could, David corrected gently. Jake appeared at the door, holding Buster in the cage. Dad, Tommy called. He said it was super scary, but that the soldiers were really nice. And he said he might come visit us here. David knelt to Jake's level. Champ, there's something I need to tell you about our house. I know. Dad, Uncle Pete told me. The house is gone, right? Gone. Jake thought for a moment. That's okay. We can build a new one. And this time, can I help choose the color of my room? David laughed for the first time in almost 24 hours. Of course, champ. You can choose any color you want. That night, the Morrison family all slept together in Pete's living room, David and Sarah on the sofa bed, Emma and Jake in sleeping bags on the floor, and Buster watching everything from his cage. It wasn't comfortable, but it was the first time in days that David felt truly at peace. Before falling asleep, he looked out the window at the mountains in the distance. They seemed calm now, majestic against the starry sky. But David knew that beneath the serene surface, geological forces continued working, slowly shaping the landscape, perhaps preparing new surprises for future generations. It was a humble reminder that, as much as humans thought they controlled their environment, nature would always have the final word. But it was also a reminder that knowledge, courage, and community could make the difference between catastrophe and survival. David fell asleep knowing he had done everything he could do, and for the first time since he had woken up worried that Tuesday morning, that was enough. 3 months later, David Morrison was standing on a hill overlooking where the northern zone of Cedar Falls used to be. Autumn had transformed the mountains into a spectacle of colors. Gold, red, and orange painted the slopes in tones that seemed almost unreal against the clear blue December sky. But where there had once been houses, streets, and gardens, there was now something different. Nature had begun its own healing process. Pioneer vegetation, hardy plants that are the first to colonize disturbed areas, was already sprouting through the mud that had solidified and formed a new soil. It's strange, Emma said beside him, how quickly nature recovers. David nodded. At 16, Emma had spent the last 3 months maturing in ways he had never imagined possible. The experience of September 15th had awakened in her not only a deeper passion for science, but a mature understanding of resilience and renewal. Nature is very good at new beginnings, David replied. We humans are the ones who sometimes have trouble with that. They were visiting Cedar Falls for the first time since that night at the command center. The family had spent the last 3 months living temporarily with Pete in Brevard, while deciding their next steps. It had been a period of many conversations, many difficult decisions, and some pleasant surprises. The biggest surprise had come 2 weeks after the landslide, when David received a call from Dr. James Morrison, no family relation. Despite the surname director of the Applied Geology program at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, Dr. Morrison, the voice on the phone had said, "Your performance during the events in Cedar Falls drew national attention. We would like to offer you a position to develop a new program for preventing geological disasters." Wilmington was on the coast, exactly where Sarah and David had talked about moving eventually. Emma could finish high school at a school with an excellent marine sciences program. Jake would have beaches to explore instead of mountains. And David could use his experience to develop systems that helped other communities avoid what had happened in Cedar Falls. "Dad," Emma interrupted his thoughts, "do you miss it?" David looked around. Downtown Cedar Falls, which had been spared by the landslide, was slowly coming back to life. Some stores had reopened, the library was operating in temporary facilities, and he could see children playing in the park that had served as the evacuation center. But the northern zone remained empty. After extensive geological studies, many of them conducted by David himself, in the weeks following the disaster, authorities had determined that the area should remain permanently unoccupied. It was geologically stable now, after the landslide had removed the unstable layers, but no one wanted to take risks. "I miss the life we had," David answered honestly, "but I don't miss the constant worry. In Wilmington, the biggest geological risk will be beach erosion," Emma laughed. "And hurricanes." "Oh yes, hurricanes, but at least hurricanes you can see coming days in." Advanced, they walked to where Maple Street had been. A small plaque marked the spot. "In memory of the 14 people who lost their lives in the September 15, 2025 landslide, and in honor of the 2,786 who were saved by the heroic efforts of first responders and the courage of citizens who trusted in science." David had insisted that his name not appear on the plaque. It had been a joint effort. Marcus's Dr. Chen, Commander Jenkins, the evacuation teams, and even people like Chuck Williams who, despite initial resistance, had acted quickly when the data became undeniable. "David Morrison, I figured I'd find you here." David turned and saw Bob Henderson approaching. The 60-something man looked as if he had aged a decade in the past 3 months, but his eyes still had the same determination as always. "Bob, how are you?" "Well, considering the circumstances." Bob looked at where his home of 40 years had been. "Margaret and I have settled into an apartment in Hendersonville. It's small, but it has a view of the mountains." "How's Tommy?" "Oh, Tommy's fine. In fact, he's better than fine. After what happened, he decided he wants to study geology like you. Says he wants to read the mountains to protect people." David smiled. "That's a good way to describe it." "David, I came here today to say something I should have said 3 months ago." "Bob, you don't have to." "I do. You tried to warn us, tried to save us, and I didn't listen because, well, because sometimes we old folks are too stubborn for our own good." Bob extended his hand. "Thank you for saving my family, and thank you for not giving up when people like me didn't want to listen." David shook Bob's hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had carried guilt for the past months, wondering if he could have done something different, something more persuasive. "Bob, you did what you thought was right based on your experience. I did what I thought was right based on the data. In the end, what matters is that we all made it out alive. And wiser," Bob added. "Tommy made me promise that if any scientist comes to tell me something dangerous is happening, I'll listen first and question later." After Bob left, David and Emma spent another hour walking around the town. They visited the temporary library, where Sarah had volunteered to help reorganize books that had been saved from the debris. They stopped at the Main Street Cafe, which had become an informal meeting point for former residents of the northern zone who came to visit. "Dr. Morrison," a familiar voice called out to them. It was Chuck Williams, the emergency coordinator who had initially resisted David's alerts. "Chuck, how are you?" "Busy. We're implementing new emergency protocols based on what we learned in September. And David, I want you to know, those protocols include a formal system for consulting with university specialists in risk situations." "That's excellent." "Chuck, it's more than excellent. It's necessary." "David, I learned that local experience and scientific knowledge aren't opposites, they complement each other. My experience told me the storm was no different from others. Your science showed why this one was different." Chuck stopped and looked at the empty northern zone. "I will never again ignore scientific data, even if it contradicts my experience." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, David and Emma prepared to return to Brevard. It would be one of the last times they visited Cedar Falls before the move to Wilmington, planned for January. "Dad," Emma said as they walked back to the car, "do you think we made a difference?" David considered the question. In the past 3 months, he had received invitations to speak at conferences across the country. Universities wanted to study the protocols developed during the Cedar Falls crisis. cities in geologically similar areas were implementing preventive monitoring systems. More importantly, Emma had decided to continue studying science. But now with a focus on science communication, how to translate technical data into information the general public could understand and use. Emma, do you remember what I always say about how changes happen? One person at a time, one decision at a time. Exactly. Bob Henderson now listens to scientists. Chuck Williams changed emergency protocols. Tommy wants to study geology. You want to work with science communication, and there are probably hundreds of other people whose lives were touched in some way. Emma nodded thoughtfully, like ripples in a pond. Like ripples in a pond. On the way back to Brevard, David reflected on the past 3 months. He had lost a house but gained perspective. He had faced the scariest moment of his career but discovered he was prepared for it. He had seen his community partially destroyed, but had also seen people come together to rebuild. And he had watched his teenage daughter mature into a young woman who understood that knowledge without courage is just information, but knowledge with courage can change the world. Dad, Emma said when they were almost there, do you already know what kind of program you're going to develop in Wilmington? I have some ideas. Real-time seismic monitoring systems, communication protocols between universities and local authorities, maybe even a public education program on geological risks. Can I help with the public education part? As a school project? David smiled. Of course. In fact, I have an idea for a project that might interest you. What is it? A mobile app that translates complex geological data into simple alerts that anyone can understand? Like a weather forecast. But for ground stability. Emma got excited. That would be amazing. People could check before buying a house, or local authorities could receive automatic alerts when risk conditions changed. Dad, that could really save lives. That's the idea. When they arrived at Pete's house, they found Jake playing in the backyard with a science project, a clay volcano model he had built for school. Dad, Emma, look, Jake shouted, pouring baking soda mixed with vinegar into the model. Eruption. David laughed, seeing his son's scientific enthusiasm. Jake had decided he wanted to study volcanoes when he grew up, because they're like mountains that slide, but with fire. Very good, champ. You're becoming a real scientist. Tommy said he's going to study earthquakes, and I'm going to study volcanoes, and then we can work together. Excellent plan. Sarah appeared at the back door, smiling at seeing the family together. The past 3 months had been difficult for her too. Leaving Cedar Falls meant leaving the position she loved at the university, the colleagues she had known over the years, the life they had built together. But she had found a new position in the literature program at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, and was excited about the possibility of working closer to the coast, in a region with a rich literary history. How was the visit? Sarah asked, hugging David. Revealing, David replied, and I think I'm finally at peace with our decisions. All of them. All of them. That night, during dinner, the Morrison family did something they had started after September 15th. They shared one thing they were grateful for that day. I'm grateful to have a family that faces changes together, Sarah said. I'm grateful I learned that sometimes changing your mind is smarter than being stubborn, Jake contributed, making everyone laugh. I am grateful to have a father who taught me that doing the right thing is sometimes scary, but always worth it, Emma said. David looked around the table, his wife, his children, even Buster watching from his cage in the corner of the room. This was not the life they had planned 3 months earlier, but it was a good life, a life built on conscious decisions, courage to face the unknown, and trust in one another. I am grateful, David finally said, to have learned that home is not a place. Home is the people you choose to face life's storms with. Pete, who had been quiet during dinner, raised his glass of iced tea, a toast to the Morrison family, for proving that sometimes the best way to save what you love is to have the courage to leave behind what you know. Everyone toasted, and David felt something he had not felt since before September 15th, complete hope for the future. Later that night, after the children had gone to sleep, David stepped out onto Pete's porch and looked at the stars. The sky was clear, with no storm clouds on the horizon. Sarah joined him, carrying 2 cups of tea. What are you thinking about? She asked. About how strange it is that the worst day of our lives might have led us to the best decisions we've ever made. Do you regret anything? David considered the question carefully. I regret not being able to save those 14 people. I will always regret that, David, but I don't regret trusting the scientific data. I don't regret evacuating our family, and I don't regret fighting to convince the authorities, even when they thought I was being dramatic. Sarah took his hand. And what about the future? Are you nervous? A little. Wilmington will be very different from Cedar Falls. But Emma is excited about the marine science program. Jake is thrilled about the beaches, and you have a new professional opportunity that excites you. And you? I have the chance to use everything I've learned to help other communities, to develop systems that can prevent other families from going through what we went through. David paused and smiled. Sarah, for the first time in months, I feel like we're on the right path. Even without knowing exactly what awaits us, especially without knowing what awaits us. Sarah, on September 15th, I learned that the only thing we can control are our own choices, and we chose to face the unknown together. As a family, they stayed on the porch for another hour, talking about plans for Wilmington, about the challenges Emma and Jake would face in a new school, about the research opportunities David would have at the coastal university. When they finally went inside, David stopped to check on the children. Jake was sleeping soundly, hugging a book about volcanoes he had borrowed from the library. Emma was reading on her tablet a scientific article about early warning systems for natural disasters. "Good night, sweetheart," David whispered. "Dad?" Emma looked up. "Can I ask you a question?" "Of course. Do you think we'll face other situations like September 15th? David sat down on the edge of Emma's makeshift bed. "I hope not exactly like that, but Emma, life will always bring challenges. Different storms, but storms nonetheless. And how do we prepare for storms we don't know are coming?" David smiled. Even at 16, Emma asked questions philosophers spent decades trying to formulate. "We prepare by being the kind of person who can face any storm, by being curious, brave, willing to learn from mistakes, and willing to trust the right people. And how do we know who the right people are? They are the ones who tell you the truth even when it's hard to hear, the ones who stand by you even when you make unpopular decisions, and the ones who help you be better than you would be on your own." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Like our family? Like our family, and like the friends we'll make in Wilmington. And like the colleagues who will work with us to make the world a little safer." "Dad?" "Yes, thank you for saving us, Emma. We saved ourselves." Together, David kissed his daughter on the forehead and went to his makeshift room on Pete's sofa bed. Sarah was already asleep, breathing softly, a book open on her chest. David carefully closed the book and covered Sarah with the blanket. Then he lay down and looked at the ceiling, reflecting on the last 3 months. 3 months earlier, he had woken up worried on a rainy morning, not knowing it would be the day that would completely change their lives. He had made decisions based on scientific data, faced skepticism, insisted when others doubted, and in the end, saved not only his family, but an entire community. Now, looking back, David could see that September 15th had not just been about a landslide. It had been about the importance of trusting knowledge, about the courage required to make difficult decisions, about how communities can come together in moments of crisis. It had been about how love for a family can give a person the strength to face any storm. David fell asleep that night knowing that, for the first time since he had woken up worried on a September morning, the future seemed not only uncertain, but full of possibilities. And in the distance, the Blue Ridge Mountains stood majestic against the night sky, ancient, powerful, and slowly being shaped by forces working on timescales that made human problems seem momentary. But that night, the mountains were quiet. The storm had passed, and a family that had learned to read the signs of nature slept in peace, knowing they had found something stronger than any rock or soil. They had found each other. Folks, we've reached the end of this story that moved me in a way I didn't expect when I started writing. The story of the Morrison family is fictional, but the geological risks David faced are very real. Landslides happen around the world every year, and they are often events that could be predicted if we paid more attention to nature's signs. David's story teaches us several important lessons. First, scientific knowledge saves lives, but only when people are willing to listen. Second, sometimes doing the right thing means making unpopular decisions based on data rather than tradition. And third, family is not just about sharing the same roof, it's about facing life's storms together. But perhaps the most important lesson is that each of us can make a difference. David was just a geologist in a small town, but when the crucial moment came, his choices saved thousands of lives. Emma, at 16, learned that science exists to protect people. Even Jake, at 12, understood that home is about the people we love, not about the place we live. If you enjoyed this story, share it with friends and family. Leave a comment about which part moved you the most. And if you know someone who works in risk areas, be it geology, meteorology, or any field that involves protecting communities, send them a thank you. They are our real-world David Morrisons, working every day to keep us safe. Thank you for following this journey. Until the next story.